Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody that has joined us from around the globe. So I would like to offer you a very warm welcome to today's webinar on the topic of the neonatal ecosystem and how evidence-based uh, design of the NICU allows for the nurturing environment in the NICU. So um, I will go through the presenter introductions in a moment. I would just like to go through the disclaimer and do an introduction to the GoToWebinar actual platform. And then I will be handing over to the presenters who will be taking you through the next hour and a bit. And then afterwards we will do the answering question session, and then I will be back with you to do the answers and question. So as I said, the webinar topic for today is the neonatal ecosystem and how evidence-based design of the NICU creates a nurturing environment. All right, and as you would have known from our invitation, our guest speakers today is Kevin Hinder and Linda Pretorius, who is recently started working with Dräger South Africa. As said, I will do the introductions to them shortly. So just as the disclaimer, the following presentation is a recording of the presentation titled The Neonatal Ecosystem on the 13th of August 2022, which is a Dräger organized and hosted educational event on the topic of how evidence-based design of the NICU allows for a nurturing environment. The authors of the presentation have permitted Dräger to share this information with you. We explicitly wish to inform you that this recording is purely for informational and educational purposes. Dräger had no influence on the presentation content, nor did Dräger take any editorial measures regarding the content of this presentation. The sole responsibility regarding the contents of the video lies with the author. All views expressed or information given are not linked to Dräger and were not censored or altered in any way. I would now like to introduce you to our speakers, Kevin Hinder and Linda Pretorius. So Kevin Hinder is the CEO of A3 Architects here in South Africa, and he is a principal shareholder and director of A3 Architects Johannesburg Pty Limited. He has 35 years of experience running this practice with a specialized focus on international and local government and private sector related planning and infrastructure design, covering the full spectrum of services, including conceptual design, documentation, feasibility analysis, and project management. Kevin has a keen interest in hospital design and has been involved with more than 300 hospital projects across Africa in countries such as South Africa, Angola, Ghana, Nigeria, the DRC, and Tanzania. Kevin has a B.Arch degree from the University of Witwatersrand and is a member of the South African Council of Architects. Since 2015, Kevin has been an external examiner as well as a moderator for the final year architectural students. He often presents to various role players in the health, care, and architectural fields in respect of the latest trends and designs. So thank you very much to Kevin for giving up his time today to join us for this webinar. Linda Pretorius, so she is our Dräger Academy project manager here in South Africa. So Linda Pretorius graduated from the University of Natal, Addington campus with a diploma in nursing, general midwifery and psychiatry, as well as community health, and she pursued a career in neonatology and pediatrics. Linda continued to work and ran various NICU and PICU units and worked in the UK before returning to South Africa to work for the Netcare Group in their hospital division, and she also worked as a trauma program manager. Linda has lectured in both neonatal and pediatric fields and has presented papers in Botswana and in Mauritius. She has also designed a lecture series for Dräger for the NICU nurses in Zimbabwe before joining Dräger South Africa early in 2022 as the Dräger Academy project manager. Since 2019, Linda ran the Little Miracle Touch, which helps babies and parents make the transition from hospital to home environment. She has helped and overseen the development of 150 babies, allowing them to progress as normal as possible. So thank you, Linda, again for also giving us your time today and making this presentation possible. So just before I do actually hand over to Linda, as she will be our first speaker for the day, I just want to share a little video with everybody. So if you just give me a second, I just want to go into the video and start it.
what we are going to do today is compare the baby elephant with the baby human, because the two species are very, very closely linked. So how they look at it is that we look at the convolutions of the brain. Your intelligence sits in the convolutions, and therefore the comparison between the baby elephant and the human baby. There's also a fair amount of work done in both species to tell us what they do when they are stressed. So Stefan Dräger has said every newborn baby deserves a good start at life and a safe place to grow. Why do we need to make a change in NICU or NICU? The brain and how it forms its circuits in a stressful time, as well as the interplay between pain and discomfort, together with the separation of the maternal figure, has been neglected in the NICU. The baby needs to be both physically and emotionally close to the mother figure, and this allows the dyad to continue their journey. The baby, the preemie, is not just preemie. The mom is a preemie as well at this stage because of the shortened gestation. So Garba Mate says, infants need the emotional closeness of the nurturing adult to regulate their neurophysiology. Separation prevents the parent from healing the baby. So today I am going to try and show you 4 aspects. We are going to look at the ecosystem in the intensive care, what the problems are. The second thing that we will look at is the interplay of oxytocin on the brain. And then we will look at cortisol and the interplay there. We will look at the sensory systems, and we will continue on to attachment. So what is an ecosystem? An ecosystem is a community of interacting organisms and their physical environment. For the neonatal ecosystem, we have a community consisting of a baby, its parents, the neonatal staff or multidisciplinary team working in an NICU, and they are supposed to be facilitating nurturing healing dependent on the hospital biobalance. So what happens during 3rd trimester? The uterus is the second strongest muscle in the female body, and it stops growing at about 32 to 33 weeks. The baby then enters a phase where it's going to gain weight and it's going to mature its organs. And at this stage, this muscle is going to be very interactive in helping the brain develop. So the baby starts midlining and flexing, allowing for the development of coordinated movements such as thumb sucking. The brain growth in the 3rd trimester is probably the fastest that it will ever be, and there is a 4-fold increase in its weight and its size in this 3rd trimester. In a normal physical environment, in other words, in the uterus will help stimulate the brain growth by providing vestibular movement as well as proprioceptive pressure. However, 15 to 25% of very low birth weight babies and prem babies will end up with neurological impairment, and this includes in the fields of motor function, vision, auditory function, cognitive behavior, and they will develop problems of ADHD, ADD, and some of their language will go. 25% of the male infants born will develop autism. So Faber et al. Posted this article recently in the last 2 months talking about the self-regulating clock. And this is the largest connection in the nervous system. It happens from the cortex through the brain stem into the corticospinal tract. And this is where they are now postulating the clock actually sits, that becomes very significant in the mid-gestational stages of this of the 2nd trimester going into the first one of the 1st trimester. Of the 3rd trimester, sorry. And this clock is affected epigenetically by the artificial environment that happens because of the lack of skin to skin very often in our units. So what does this clock do? It does the circadian levels, the diurnal levels. It helps with regulation of a baby, and it also has the interplay of cortisol and oxytocin. So what is the problem with cortisol and oxytocin? Cortisol is a hormone released during times of stress, and what happens is it increases the blood pressure, it increases the heart rate, it increases the respiration, and the blood glucose goes up. And at the same time, it relaxes the muscle. So what happens is when you go into flight and fright, what your body says is, right, what are we going to do and how are we going to do this? Your eyes open up and you start breathing faster, your blood pressure goes up, you have this release of glucose and the muscles relax so you can give much longer steps. Both these species, human and elephant, unfortunately, have to wait a little while for this transition to happen. Luckily with elephants within 2 hours, but with humans, it can take up to a year before the baby is able to actually move away from the problem. Premature babies the premature infants' cortisol works very suboptimally, so it just doesn't work properly, and it causes changes in that developing brain. And those changes are life-altering for the child and the family. So cortisol affects the neuroendocrine pathways in an infant, utilizing the vagal system. This is why they very often become apneic when their levels of cortisol are too high. Low cortisol levels have been shown to be present in children with generalized anxiety disorder and PTSD. So what often happens because of the epigenetic effect on these receptors is that later on these children don't respond to cortisol at all. So what happens during flight and fright is that we see that the physiological reaction occurs and when somebody perceives there to be a harmful attack or a threat on life. And if you look at this MRI scan to your left, what you will notice is that the right-handed image, there's fields missing there. That is due to overexposure of cortisol. So in short, small doses of cortisol will save your life, but lots of cortisol actually changes the pathways in the brain. And what this means is that the individual cannot access higher function. So they really battle to be able to function at school much later on. But in the NICU, these babies battle to drink, they battle to make eye contact, they battle to bond with their parents. Oxytocin is the counter hormone to cortisol. And oxytocin is actually only released in about 4 or 5 instances. So during the birthing process, the pressure of the uterus will cause a flood of oxytocin to the baby. And that's why when it goes skin to skin onto mom, there's immediate eye contact and the attachment process starts. Later on, there's some in the breast milk. And then later on, it will only really happen if you have quite a hard hug for more than 30 seconds, or you have a deep massage, or in a sexual environment. During the CAP study, what they found was that stressed infants showed regional alterations to their brain structure and function, and that's very important. So there was a reduction in the parietal and frontal cortex growth areas and poor connectivity to the temporal lobes. This will affect the personality long term as well. Abnormal movements were seen early on in the nursery. But what is epigenetics? Epigenetics is actually nurture in nature. So epigenetics is the new study that shows that there isn't a gene code change that occurs, but the gene expression changes. And the interesting thing here to note is that it doesn't just affect that baby, it will actually affect that baby's baby. Both the species have problems with this. So if a baby elephant is removed from a herd or separated from a herd sort of after 48 hours and it's received enough colostrum, these babies have to go into nurseries with babies of similar age, and they have to receive weighted blankets, which make them think they're still under mum. And with that, they get a human that is with them 24/7. That way, the cortisol levels drop, and it allows for a better temperament in that baby elephant to develop. If they don't do it, this is when we see the aggressive elephant. So what happens with sensory development? Sensory development is at its peak for both species at birth. And the reason for this is that we have to survive as mammals. If we were reptiles, this wouldn't be important. But as birds and as mammals, it is very, very important. So you can see on the yellow graph that by 36 weeks of pregnancy, the sensory pathways are very much in, and they are there to save lives. Language comes later, and so does higher cognitive function. So let's look at the various senses as they develop. At 17 weeks, the baby's swallowing. By 34 weeks, the baby's taking 750 mils of amniotic fluid. So mom's skin, amniotic fluid, and breast milk smell and taste the same. Babies will dysregulate in an intensive care setup very quickly with strong perfumes or skin products. And this can be a long-term issue and cause behavior such as you very often see these children at about 3 or 4 in a restaurant smelling their plate of food before they will actually eat it. The elephant smell is highly developed as well, and it is recently been shown in an article from Stellenbosch that herds actually have a so-called perfume. So one herd can recognize another herd on its smell, but not only that, both the human mother and elephant mother and babies work off their Jacobson organ, which is very interesting. So it's not, the smell doesn't come from deeper in the brain, it actually works from within the nose at this stage. Taste. Well, at 16 weeks, the taste buds are formed, and by 24 to 27 weeks, the baby will react to sweet or bitter. And by 28 to 29 weeks, they're reacting very positively to mom's milk. 70% of babies in the NICU will have feeding issues due to the sensory overload and insufficient skin-to-skin contact. The lack of emotional support and the loss of vestibular movement and proprioception will cause them to not be able to access higher function. And the problem there is that sucking is actually a higher function at this stage. It tells us very much of how intact that brain is. Tactily, the baby at 15 weeks can grab the cord. By 22 weeks, the skin is intact and a sense of touch is present. At 24 weeks, the cortical pathway for touch comes in. Touch aversions are very common in babies, especially where skin-to-skin was commenced late or not at all. And the early effect of not having skin-to-skin tactily is that these babies become flaccid and docile in the nests. And this does not allow for healthy development at all. Auditorily, this is a huge problem because of the noise in the unit and because of the artificial noise in the unit, which lends itself to causing noise pollution. So by 25 weeks, all the big structures of the ear is in place. However, the hair cells of the cochlea, which is where sound really starts being generated from, will only start at about 26 to 28 weeks. And then they are only open to specific frequencies. So if you go back and look at that clip on the elephants and there was sound from the actual elephants, what you would have heard is a humming noise. They sort of purr over the baby. What they do is they push air through the trunk, and that helps settle the baby after this huge shock of being born. The decibel range in the uterus is about 90 hertz. However, the biggest problem is this artificial noise in the intensive care. And we have to be careful with the use of music before 32 weeks. And definitely no orchestra music because it causes a cacophony in that brain before 40 weeks. Vision, also a huge problem. The neurons of the eye are already there at 26 weeks, but there's a massive rapid growth of the actual eye between 28 and 40 weeks. And the pupils react at about 30 to 32 weeks. Not only is retinopathy of the prematurity a problem because of the overexposure to oxygen and ventilation, but there's further problems that develop when these babies are left with the lights on 24/7. So it affects their sleep patterns. They don't learn to regulate at all, but it also doesn't activate the circadian rhythm, and the constant bright light causes reading problems later at school. But what we see them present with at discharge is strabismus, myopia, and amblyopia, which is basically the lazy eye. You will very often see these babies later in clinics that as you work with them and they tire, the one eye almost pulls as if there's a little fly on their nose. So the vestibular system, the proprioceptive system, and the interoceptive systems are the three senses in the head. And without vestibular, there is actually large problems that develop in the neonatal nursery. So what vestibular movement is forward and backwards movements, left to right, right to left, up and down movement, and round and round. Now, the way pregnancy works is in third trimester, the mother starts to waddle, and that is actually accentuating the vestibular movement. And so that allows the brain to calm down. But not only that, it takes the 5 outer senses and converts that and moves it into the central brain. And then from there, it puts it where it has to file properly. So if you consider what happens in a neonatal ICU, there's very little vestibular movement. And it is thought that this causes the so-called brain fog that leads to the developmental delay together with the loss of proprioceptive systems. So by 25 weeks, the vestibular system is intact and working well. And by 28 weeks, the baby has a full Moro reflex. Why mention it here? Well, the reason for it is every time you see a Moro, know that that baby's received a dose of cortisol. And that dose of cortisol is now sending it into a flight or fright reaction. The proprioceptive system, by 12 weeks, the baby can touch the placenta. But what proprioception really is how hard you open a drawer, close a door, people pushing up against you. And in the uterus, the pressure of that muscle as the baby grows puts more and more pressure onto muscles and joints, allowing it to develop properly. So if you consider a baby lying in your NICU or your NICU, and it can lift its arm, it can literally take its arm from its abdomen and put it behind its ear if it so wished. It wouldn't be able to do that in uterus. In the uterus, it would only be able to move that arm probably 1.5 centimeters. So that movement, that joint movement causes problems. Positioning in the NICU also causes problems because you get shortening of some muscles and lengthening of others, or joints not being supported correctly. So Heidi Als, the mother of developmental care, said the following statement. And what is important about this is that if we stress these babies in the first 24 to 48 hours with the light, the noise, the touch, everything else that goes on, these babies stop fighting. Before that, they will make movements in the nest like they would in the womb. So they move and carry on. But the minute at about 48 hours, they now become flaccid and submissive. And this is problematic. The only way we can continue good development is to start with kangaroo care. Now we're just going to chat to you about attachment, because this is very problematic. So attachment in both the elephant and the human being has to happen for normal relationships to develop. Attachment is the special development between the infant and the primary caregiver, initially the mum, and then the parents and the family around it. Similar with the elephant. And it's very dependent on eye contact between the two individuals. If you want to look at it more, you can go and have a look at the still face experiment and see how these babies, as John Bowlby says, can elicit attachment behavior very early on. So initially, it is that looking and gazing of the parents in the baby and the goo goo gaga, I love you situation. After that, it's when the baby starts smiling and people react to it. And so the baby attaches to these primary caregivers. If they do not attach correctly, it becomes problematic. And what happens in the neonatal intensive care area, as Marina Futes has stated in her latest article, is that lots of these babies show an insecure attachment. And most of this insecure attachment is classified as an anxious attachment. And that is with regards to they constantly see the parents being anxious because the baby's ill, and the baby starts attaching on anxiety. Also, these babies battle to regulate later on. So they have the so-called meltdown for up to 3 years quite easily. Early skin to skin will reduce these problems. Infant mother separation is referred to as separation dependent stress, and this leads to poor attachment. The mothers often are diagnosed with PTSD. They battle to attach to these babies. Prem babies have a much higher risk of having non-accidental injuries, or the so-called CAFI syndrome. And this is basically due to the fact that very often the units don't allow sufficient space for the parents to be there all the time. Skin to skin is not encouraged. And during skin to skin, there's a release of oxytocin, which has this eye contact, and both of them settle down. So they both regulate, both the parent and the baby. It's measured, and how do we look at it? It's by looking at the heart rate variability. If the doctors want to do a study, they would look at cortisone and oxytocin. But you would notice in the NICU that what would happen is the heart rate comes down, saturations improve, breathing regulates, and these babies do far better on the human incubator than they do on the equipment. The sympathetic nervous system in the mammal is associated to flight and fright, and therefore homeostasis, so in other words, your hemodynamics, will also indicate when these babies are very stressed. So in this review done by Ione et al., there were 22 studies done that looked at the effect of skin to skin. And what that study concluded was that cortisol levels drop significantly in both parent and infant, allowing for good attachment, utilizing oxytocin. And so what oxytocin does is it reduces the reactivity of the cortisol, allowing for regulation firstly. So that allows the baby to access higher function, which then allows for eye contact between the infant and the baby, and the infant and the parent. And this is on an epigenetic effect. So babies that don't receive a lot of physical touch, cuddling, chatting to eye contact do worse than babies that do receive a lot of this. So I am now moving into Kevin's domain. Evidence-based design, like evidence-based care, is dependent on credible research. And currently we see the following issues in NICUs. Too small care areas, crammed with equipment, physically forcing the parent out. Inappropriate use of space, not facilitating parent involvement, and incorrect or not using equipment optimally, which doesn't allow for good, healthy development. This allows, if the area is designed correctly, it allows the parent to be involved, especially the mother, in the physical care of the baby. And that's how the attachment starts, with physical touch. The parental involvement improves organization, improves sleep states, and good neurological outcomes long-term with healthy attachment. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. I will now hand over to Kevin for the second part of this presentation.
Well, welcome everybody. It's a hard act to follow after Linda. Privileged to be invited to presentation today, and I have been introduced. Welcome to everybody, and thank you for taking the time up this morning and to be part of the presentation, to listen to the presentation. My background is ostensibly as a healthcare architect. Over the last 30 years, we've been privileged to have been involved in a number of projects, extensive learning, and yeah, hopefully what we are going to be discussing today is going to be able to contribute to the improvement of the general healthcare environment, and specifically the neonatal ICU. So I think just to start the presentation, A3 Architects as a firm is South African based, have international and local experience in healthcare. And I guess, Linda, just to pick up on your presentation, as an architect, I think the general impression is that we are ditzy technical pseudo engineers with an artsy-fartsy approach to the world. But in the healthcare space, I think it's a slightly different environment. And in that environment, our responsibility is magnified. We have a interesting and difficult task of trying to consolidate and blend a very complex building type, the complex building types that choreographs not only health and well-being, but patient experience and efficiency. So I guess we started the presentation. When we started the presentation as humans, one of our primary orientation mechanisms, and Linda's spoken to the vast array of neurological stimulus requirements that we do have as humans, but I think for us as architects generally, but particularly in the healthcare space, I always walk into one of the hospitals that we've designed, or any hospital for that matter, with an acute awareness. And that acute awareness is essentially about the experience of the user. The user experience in the hospital is vast and different. I think that the primary neurological response to a hospital environment is fear-based. There are very few users that would choose to visit the hospital voluntarily. I think people are intimidated by hospital environments because it talks to our fundamental psyche, and our fundamental psyche is that fight or flight response. And I think subliminally, in a hospital environment, we generally experience a flight response because we perceive the environment to be a high threat environment where there's a threat of danger and a threat to life generally. So we arrive in an environment, in the hospital environment, our subconscious state is essentially phrased or paraphrased by 4 or 5 subliminal emotions, and these are the subliminal emotions that exist in us subconsciously to ensure that we remain safe and that we stay alive and at a higher level of functioning, that we are comfortable. So we arrive in an environment, and the first question that we're asking ourselves subliminally, either consciously or subconsciously, is who am I? Who am I in this environment? How am I going to experience the environment? And what is my response to my environment? So who am I in the hospital context comes at you with variable answers. You are either a clinical caregiver, you're a patient, you're a visitor. You know, that response is variable, and I think the variability of that response discharges the responsibility on the designer and the architect of that environment to make sure that the environment is going to appeal to a broad range of users. So I know that this talk is specifically focused on the neonatal ICU, but the neonatal ICU in the context of healthcare design is one element of the total environment. So we will be focusing on the neonatal and obviously talking specifically to some of the areas that Linda has raised in terms of comfort and association. But the second question that we ask ourselves, sorry, there's just some background noise, if you give me 1 minute. The second question after establishing who am I in an environment is where am I? And I think in a hospital context, the where am I is the one that induces the most amount of stress. You know, do I know where to go is one of the big questions arriving at the front door of hospital. The other one, and probably the bigger one, is do I know how to escape? So wayfinding and orientational in hospital design is one of the core elements that leads to end user satisfaction in a relatively stress-free environment. And the other question that gets asked is this space safe and comfortable? And I think that the majority of users, even people who are caregivers, they arrive in a hospital environment, and I think there's always the question of safety and comfort. And safety in a number of arenas, safety not just in a physical space, but in an emotional space as well. So hospitals generally are highly emotive spaces. One of the other questions that we'll ask ourselves arriving in any new environment, but particularly in a hospital, is what is my expectation of this experience? You know, what am I expecting from this experience? What is the outcome? And again, this talks to your fundamental fight and flight response. Linda spoke about cortisol and all the fancy human chemicals that are released, and these are all essentially to ensure that we stay alive. And then one of the last questions that we possibly be asking ourselves, or not the last questions, one of the fundamental questions is, why am I here? You know, how do you arrive in this space? What are you doing there? And in a hospital context, the answer to that question is fairly unique. You're there essentially because you're wanting to sustain and maintain life. And you're starting to talk to diametrically opposed emotions. So you are in you're in hospital environment reluctantly. It's a destination venue, and you have specific perceptual responses to that environment. So as an architect, and coming back to the point, sorry, I do tend to digress a little bit, but and it is one of the passions and why I do enjoy designing hospitals, is because we are trying to create environments that are a bit more nurturing, a bit more comfortable, obviously safe, and we are, in so doing, responsibility as an architect is to be cognizant of the multiple responsibilities that befall us and befit us in the integration of this environment from a perceptual, experiential perspective, from a safety perspective, and then obviously one of the bigger challenges is from an engineering perspective. So we have a responsibility to maintain comfortable, safe environments and to create comfortable, safe environments that people can that people experience. So yeah, ultimately, how do we perceive and experience the world? And in experiencing and perceiving the world in a neonatal context, and Linda has very accurately described the PREMI environment and the demands on creating a PREMI environment that talks to health, wellness, and well-being. We try as architects to create an environment that essentially will feel familiar, comfortable, safe, happy, and where the patient ultimately can feel cared for. The antithesis of that is an environment where the patient ends up feeling afraid, alone, threatened, and uncomfortable. So I'm going to just run through some of the ideas specifically relating to the neonatal ICU. So neonatal design is critical for the infant and their development, as well as for the family and the staff. And I think this is one area that has been substantially ignored in many NICU design development, is the development and well-being of both family and the staff. I think the focus for too long has been on the sustainability of the preemie infant. As an architectural firm, we focus on the sensory environment and the implications that it has for NICU design. Designing a neonatal intensive care unit requires meeting the needs of all the patients, their parents, the personnel, nurses, doctors, technical staff, and management. So a substantial challenge in terms of creating an environment that speaks to everybody and that creates both a subliminal, conscious and unconscious reduction in anxiety. So I'm going to start, let's talk to, and I think for the South African audience particularly, I have specifically pulled up this example because it's almost the antithesis of the type of environment that we come to expect as normal in the South African healthcare system. In the South African healthcare system, the majority, if not all of the neonatal units that I've been exposed to are open plan environments that talk specifically to the clinical requirements and the requirements of the staff for efficient nursing and visibility. So this presentation is going to talk to some ideas around the emerging awareness of modifying the neonatal environment to sustain and support and the well-being of the entire unit, being the family, the caregiver, as well as the preemie. In this particular example by Field and Clegg Bradley Studios, you'll see that it's a larger unit. The unit is designed with self-contained rooms. The room sizes are similar to conventional patient environments as opposed to the open plan environment. And those environments can sustain an entire family unit and also talks to visibility and access, privacy and environmental control, which is one of the areas seriously lacking in our current NICU units. You know, Linda was talking about the impact of sound, in the impact of light, both artificial and natural, and then obviously quality of air in terms of smell. All of these are responsibilities that the architect needs to take into consideration in the design of a new unit. In this particular unit, two elements are linked in terms of the support activities required for conventional patient care. And these elements are linked with the umbilicus, which also provides an access point for emergency vehicles. You know, transfers and transfers of preemies is obviously fairly common. Babies arriving from facilities where there are inadequate services. That's one of the considerations that we need to take into account in the design as well. In this particular instance, the building encloses an external courtyard space, providing both vista and breakout from reception and parent areas, so parents can move between indoor and outdoor quite freely. The grouping of the care rooms forms a route around the staff base, which is the heart of the unit. So what would initially appear to be a diametrically opposed requirement in the spatial planning, where you want full access to the preemie, the patient and the family, as well as convenient access by all staff, all support activities has been fairly well taken care of in this particular instance. Parents and staff can perceive changing external conditions through day and night. One of the big issues in the units that I've observed is very often the unit is isolated. There's no access to diurnal adjustments day and night. Fresh air is obviously a complex issue in a healthcare environment because of the requirement for sterile environments, the reduction of infection. So in this particular instance, there's a very clever and very good introduction of natural light in a controlled fashion. The heart of the clinical area is therefore generously filled with roof light or rooflet areas, providing daylight to all the central spaces. Sunlight is allowed to enter the building in certain controlled areas without disturbing the working of the unit. So those internal areas can be modified to be darkened and lightened, but critically they are environments that can be controlled independently. And I think, again, from my experiences of NICU units in open plan environment, there are a number of issues that aren't addressed in terms of the well-being and the development of the patient. So the neonatal unit, just an analysis, quite a nice little diagram. I thought, what is your responsibility as an architect in a neonatal environment? There's an acknowledgement that you are dealing with a new life, responsibilities to provide care and protection, to provide the support that's required, to provide daylight and sunlight. And then there's a tracking of the developmental path of preemie or neonatal patient. There's the birth, intensive care, special care, and home care. And the architect comments that we hope that the building will have a real influence and improve the outcomes for vulnerable babies, their parents, and the amazing staff who look after them. They comment they're especially pleased with the calmness created by the quality of daylight, sunlight, the control and management of ventilation, fresh air, and the general environment, which will help lower the stress levels and lift the spirits of parents and staff. And to Linda's point, I think that very often in the neonatal unit, most emphasis is given to the well-being and care of the preemie, but the mom too is going through a period of extreme anxiety. Her expectations have not been fulfilled. There's extreme emotions being experienced by the mother, the family, and the child. A normal childbirth would have been a very different experience, and nobody actually expects to or plans on ending up in a neonatal unit. So that requirement for a familiar, comfortable, safe, happy environment and experience, the mother is obviously going to feel to a large extent betrayed. So how do we create comfort generally? We create comfort through the use of modifications to the environment in terms of visibility, quality of light, both natural and artificial, color, the introduction of soft furnishings, emulating as far as possible the natural home environment from an architectural perspective. And one of the challenges in healthcare design, obviously, is that by very nature, the equipment that sustains life is an alien equipment inside a space. So to try and create an environment that creates a feeling of well-being and that a patient can associate with is always a challenge. The environment, total environment, again, talking to color, texture, symbolism. And in this instance, the kind of blended approach to the neonatal care instead of the solitary room environment, starting to talk to an ICU, a conventional ICU design with good visual separation, but maintaining open plan and visibility. Color, this particular example is very much a hospital design. It's not trying to pretend that it's a home environment. It's catering for a blend of staff convenience and accessibility. Cleanliness, obviously one of the other issues. Sterile environments generally tend to have a sterile feel, but by introducing texture and color, you can reduce the impact of that. This is more of an alien environment. Certainly doesn't talk to, by antithesis, doesn't talk to the establishment of an environment that is nurturing and friendly. The use of hostile equipment, and we use that in inverted commas, stainless steel, etc. It certainly talks to the clinical requirements. But in terms of the nurturing, caring design, I think you can very easily feel the antithesis in the different kind of spatial experiences. Unfortunately, these experiences, by virtue of the nature of this presentation, are only the visual experience. We try and encompass and embellish the entire experience. So the experience, as stated previously, is tactile, it's visual, and it's also very much has to do with smell. An interplay of elements and lighting, soft lighting, toning down and blending the medical equipment environment in neonates. There's a large emphasis or shift in emphasis on the dominance of the medical equipment in the space planning. It obviously needs to be accommodated for. There are certain engineering requirements, or specific engineering requirements, the obvious ones that need to be accommodated. But one of the emerging trends, thank goodness, is the emergence of the neonatal ICU with single family rooms. And this talks to the kangaroo care that Linda made reference to, the ability and capacity to normalize an environment, to create a free flow for the potential interaction between the preemie and the mom, the permanent availability of mom as part of the caregivers group, so that it's not just a pure clinical environment. I think the increased awareness of the role of mother as caregiver, promoting the health and well-being of the infant. To Linda's point, neonatal babies have close and regular contact with their mothers, grow quicker, regulate their breathing and temperatures faster, and ultimately spend less time in the neonatal unit. Parents report that the more time they spend caring for the babies in the neonates, the more competent they too feel when their baby is discharged. And that's obviously one of the huge elements as well, particularly in a neonatal environment, is the fear that a mother feels on discharge. You know, how do they manage and handle this tiny little infant? Are they going to be able to deal with it competently? And this is part of the training and normalization of both the mother and child environment. So as illustrated, you know, the care environment, most of the units that I have observed are alien environments. They certainly don't encourage full family integration in the ICU. The clinical equipment, the presence of the clinical equipment and the integration of the clinical equipment into the environment is generally insensitively dealt with the primary focus on the clinical care. But the holistic care in a holistically designed environment certainly leads to a better outcome and a better patient experience generally. Not to say that it doesn't, that the design of a neonatal unit can't be clinically dealt with. I think in this particular instance, you see that there is a fairly strong emphasis on the engineering support, the provision of the electrical, gas, etc. But by providing some of the essential support items, I think you can, to an extent, and I know that cost is always an issue, you can improve the general patient experience. So the trend in technology, and I think, again, Linda spoke specifically to this, but there is a new advanced care trend in the installation of infant-specific MRI equipment into NICUs, quality of lighting, maintenance of the general environment and the compact of the machines. Supporting advanced neurological research studies will ultimately help clinicians better understand the short and long-term consequences of babies born prematurely with very low birth weights and cognitive function. Some illustration of the support equipment. You know, by nature, the medical support equipment and environment is very alien to the majority of end users. To try and temper the alien nature of that environment is obviously a challenge that has now been embraced. And then stimulation. So stimulation suites are becoming an integral part of the design in neonates. They provide space for staff to keep up to date on training on how to respond to emergency situations. So support for staff is obviously critical. Sorry, I'm jumping around. And for me, this is a really nice example of a neonatal environment, an integrated neonatal environment, where there is a full range of sensory experiences without compromising the technical requirement for the healthcare. You'll see there's an external stimulus, potential for modification of light, support in terms of environmental comfort is not over the top. So this is the kind of environment that I think should be and could be promoted as a standard in the neonatal unit. Again, a little bit more clinical, self-contained. I've got a bit of a concern about the design of this particular type of unit, starting to become a bit sterile. And that's possibly, again, another blend in terms of the convenience from a technical perspective, but from a design perspective, also a little bit alienating. This is one of the newer units that has been constructed in the UK. And in summary, an optimally designed ICU or neonates has many possible health implications, including improved breastfeeding rates, infection, noise control, reduced length of stay, hospitalization, potentially improved neonatal morbidity and mortality. The impact on early life development on later child health and development is well recognized and documented. And preliminary evidence suggests that the neonatal design may influence environmental exposures during a crucial period of brain development and social bonding, which can lead to long-term health implications. Ultimately, a well-designed NICU has the potential to improve developmental outcomes and reduce chronic illnesses. So, yeah, that's a high-level overview. I hope that at least some of the pictures have stimulated some new thinking. And in closing, as architects, as clinicians, patients, parents, we need to be aware of the impact that we do have and can have on the environment around us. And we need to also maintain a level of consciousness and awareness about what it is that we're doing and what the outcomes are that we could anticipate. So our objective of design as architects, our primary objective is to continually learn, to continually develop and explore new opportunities and new solutions. Single family room design for neonatal units is highly recommended. I know that that is not a norm, certainly in our environment in South Africa, but maybe we need to rethink some of the fundamentals on neonatal design. Consideration needs to be given to infection prevention and control, including frequency, fishing, water feature safety, airborne, natural light. Finishes should have an acoustic and illuminative suitability, as well as allowing for infection prevention where possible, be environmentally sustainable. Provision of support areas for family, staff, and clinical activity are also important, as is the need to support mothers in breastfeeding. So ultimately, architects and design teams should be equipped with the evidence base for positive design features that would impact on the care of the newborn infant. Support the caring families and the well-being of staff. High-quality, family-centered neonatal care should be supported through well-grounded, technologically enabled and future-proof design concepts. I think that's the close for me. Certainly from an architectural perspective, we embrace the responsibility and the opportunity to create modified neonatal environments that support patient well-being, not only of the preemie, but of the family and of the caregivers.
Thank you very, very much, Kevin, and to Linda as well, our first speaker, for the very informative presentations. We're going to now move back over onto the question part, and So if you do have any questions, please do post these into the question box, and I will then read out the questions to the speakers and give them the opportunity to answer your questions. So currently there are no questions in the box. So I will allow just a few minutes for if there are any questions still coming through, and if there's no questions coming through, then we will end off the webinar for the day. So 2 questions have come in. The first one being, with the cost of hospital design per square meter so high, how does one convince the client to move to family design rooms?
If I may answer that question, I think
Please
that,
do.
and then quite interestingly, I've just come back from an extensive tour of Turkey, believe it or not. And I think Turkey at the moment, from what I experienced there, is certainly becoming one of the leaders in the healthcare environment, or design and healthcare environment. The focus on cost, it's a big topic. It's obviously a topic that we deal with extensively and on a daily basis. Healthcare environments are expensive environments, but I think maybe just to, and I could spend hours talking to the issue of cost of healthcare. Ultimately, the cost of healthcare is not just a financial consideration, and I know that we get pushback from all of our key clients. We work with all the key healthcare providers. We get pushback from our clients on building costs, and it generally translates back into a cost per square meter. But the rationale, and there is evidence to support the rationale, or to support the argument, is that, you know, we often get the question thrown at us that a hospital is a cost per square meter rate, and it definitely isn't. And we've done many exercises to prove the contrary. You have a fixed cost element in any environment. That fixed cost element does not necessarily get impacted at the same ratio if you increase the size of the unit. So in an ICU environment, as a general ratio, your M&E component, or the mechanical engineering support component, constitutes about 40% of that general cost. Your finishes, you know, whether you're building a room of 5 square meters or whether you're building a room of 20 square meters, your fixed cost elements, as your walls move out, for example, to increase the size of the space, essentially what changes in that environment is your floor plate area. So creating bigger spaces, obviously, there's a logic that tells you that it's going to be more expensive, but I think that it's not a pro rata increase in cost based on the reduction in size, and actually quite the contrary. Very often, the smaller the unit gets, the higher the square meter rate for the development of that same relative area is. So squeezing all of these clinical environments into tiny little spaces that are dysfunctional may save you a couple of rand, but it comes at an enormous cost in terms of the efficiency and the inpatient experience. And then also bearing in mind that a hospital generally has a lifespan of over 50 years. And the 10 rand that you spend today has to remain functional and efficient for the lifespan of that building. So yes, we are always fighting the fight about the size of hospitals, the efficiency and the cost. But I think that it's high time that we actually start mitigating the financial impact against the other impacts, the emotional, environmental, and the efficiency.
Thank you, Kevin.
Tanya?
So the next, yes.
Tanya, I just want to comment on that as well. I think Kevin is right to remember that cortisol will age organs dramatically, and what the research is showing now in successful premies that have reached their 30s is that we've got incredible problems now with hypertension, diabetes, all these so-called stress diseases. So there's depression, there's everything else. And if you in a hospital or in a governmental situation look at that, the cost long term far medically far outweighs the cost of putting in a family-centered care area because of all and everything that will have to happen with that baby because there wasn't parental or family-centered care allowing for a better baby to leave there, a far healthier baby. And I think that needs to be kept at the back of the minds of these people who want to reduce these sizes.
Thank you very much, Linda. So the next question is, in Mauritius setup, we have 6 incubators in a closed space. I want to know, what is the recommended distance between incubators, please?
Yeah, I'll answer that question as well. So, I mean, we're now starting to talk to statutory and regulatory requirements. And obviously, that's also one of the issues that need to be dealt with in the planning of a neonatal unit. But the statutory recommended distance is 2.4 meters between cribs. So, yeah, to answer your question, in the conventional open plan environment, that is the norm in the ICU unit. There's a minimum space requirement of 2.4 meters, which is a very low requirement if you take into consideration, and maybe Linda can talk to this, the amount of equipment that is required to support the new premise life.
I agree. The equipment, the staff will push the parent physically out of that area. And there literally isn't space then. There's nothing. I mean, if you look at an incubator, basically it's 1.1 meters, and then add to that a ventilator, which is on average 40 centimeters. Add to that monitoring, which is another 40. We've already almost taken up the 2 meters of what's there. And now physically add a nurse in that space plus a doctor. You really don't have much space left.
Thank you very much for that answer. The next question is, what are the effects of the observation lights used by nurses in dim lighting NICUs on babies' vision?
So if the light is dim, that's okay. The actual problem that occurs is if there's bright light all the time, because if you remember when we discussed the sensory part of my talk, I said to you the eye grows rapidly. Overexposure to very bright light will actually cause the nerve endings to become thinner, and these babies have sight problems long term. For instance, if a teacher was to write the word cat on the board, these kids often read tack. So they start switching things over because that actual pathway hasn't developed properly because of far too much light. So dim light shouldn't be all the time, as Kevin has shown, that there needs to be access to healthy normal light or natural light. And then if we do need to use lights at night, to rather look at sort of under floor, from the floor up lighting. But it is problematic because the staff circadian rhythms also kick in that dim area. So they do tend to become, let's be real, they do go to sleep in those areas.
Thank you very much, Linda. So the next question is, can we have some advice on how to implement kangaroo care in the restrictive environments that we currently have?
Yeah, so sorry, from a design perspective, what we are doing to a number of units is obviously within the currently designed environment. Most units don't allow for kangaroo care or for in-family care. That would have to be done by way of an extension or modification in the construction of that space. So you'd need to either add to the space. What we also have done in a number of units is that we provide ancillary support areas or breakaway areas that are attached to the unit, where the mother is not necessarily too remote, but can possibly move out of the clinical environment, or the specific clinical environment, for intermediate kangaroo care.
Also, Tanya, I think it's bed space planning from a nursing point of view. So very often to do kangaroo care on, say, a ventilated baby, the ventilator and the IV therapy needs to be on the same side, because that allows for transfer across to the parent. The other thing that you would see is in Kevin's slide presentation is very often the beds are off center. So we move away from this idea that the incubator must stand in the center and the monitor must be here, but if lots of them are off center, which allows a bit more space for the parents and the staff to move around that bed, and that will allow for at least a chair to move into that area if you want to do it. But it is organizing the bed space so that where the monitor is, generally you've got more play on monitor leads and that sort of thing than you have on IV. So it's better then to move towards where the ventilator is with your pump setup.
Thank you very much. So the next one is thank you very much for the very informative presentation, Linda and Kevin. And the next one is another question. So how does one improve on room temperature for general open space where air conditioning or ventilation is utilized by staff, parents, and also baby? Should the design of independent baby to one air conditioning system be utilized over general or central air conditioning?
Yeah, from a technical perspective, as a planner, I think air conditioning is always a very interesting debate and discussion in the healthcare context. I always start my argument fairly fundamentally, that if we normalize our environment to what we could anticipate at home, and we are obviously all located in various places in the world, and one has to ask yourself the question, do we normally, or do we, as a norm, do we live in air-conditioned environments and air-conditioned spaces? That's the first question. And I think, particularly in the South African context, air conditioning certainly is a luxury. It does help to maintain, modify, and regulate air temperature and air quality. So you've got to acknowledge the importance and important role that it does play. But regulating singular environments is in itself problematic. So if you could give individual and independent air conditioning control from a temperature perspective initially, and obviously firstly, primarily, you'll find that people are toying with the air conditioning and modifying air temperature anything between 24 and 18 degrees, which places strain on the system. Firstly, and secondly, to try and create and normalize the air temperature by virtue of artificial ventilation, as we've all come to know it, is the one approach. The very interesting development in healthcare environments is the introduction of what they call tabs, a tab system. So a tab system essentially regulates the entire thermal mass of the building. So from a thermal perspective, you're not managing and controlling your air temperature by virtue of air or air quality, which is the norm in the air conditioning environment. So we generally air conditioning and air conditioning design, we make use of air to regulate temperature and air quality. So there is quite a strong move away from using air as the primary regulator of the environment. You can regulate the environment, as I said earlier, through various mechanisms. Artificial heating, obviously, is the other one. It's a complex topic. Sorry, I mean, I could carry on forever, but I think that in the general environment, the open plan, neonatal environment, air quality and air temperature is regulated through general air conditioning on a centralized system, and that's the current norm. I think there's a lot of space for design development and initiatives in air quality control and temperature control through mechanical means.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Linda, do you want to add to this?
Yeah, I do. The big thing here is the staff actually knowing the incubators as well. When we use open incubators, and as far as I'm concerned, the open incubator system should not be used as liberally as it is. It should really only be used for a very, very sick infant or your term infants. What often happens is that the staff actually don't place the actual temperature probe in the right place or with the right accessories. And then what happens is that that specific piece of equipment keeps coming on and off, on and off. And in an open structure, if you've got 4 or 5 of these open incubators coming on and off, it will affect the air conditioning, and it does drain it. So yes, also as staff, being aware how the equipment works optimally and doing that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Linda. So I think the last question for today, as we've already run out of overtime, so I will take this last question and then we will end off the session. So what is the recommended spacing between medical equipment devices in a closed NICU and the noise level for the equipment alarm systems?
Okay, so thank goodness for smartphones, because you can download a decibel app now where you can measure your alarm systems. The problem in an open environment is that baby A doesn't know that it's baby C's alarm going off. And so baby A, B, and C all go into a morose because they think that that alarm is their alarm, and they very quickly learn that alarms mean that you're going to be hurt. So keeping the alarm limit down is important. It is unacceptable within an intensive care unit, for instance, to keep the QRS complex, the beeping on at all times, because staff don't react to it after 20 minutes, the research shows. So, you know, you've got to keep the alarm volume down, unless it is a big procedure being done and we are cognitive of what's going on. That's the first thing. And then between equipment, I don't know. I've never ever seen anything to that effect. But I can just tell you that the ventilator will give you a hertz of 55 generally. That's what we get off it when we look at it and measure it. And then add the alarms from the monitoring plus the odd pump going off. It gets very loud in there. So, you know, it is hard to control it. And I would suggest that you look at using one of the better decibel meters, which allows you then to control the noise. The research is showing that it's not so much the day noise pollution that's problematic, it's actually the night pollution that's a problem, because there's never a period for the babies to enter the deep sleep state.
Thank you very much, Linda. And I think this brings us now to the end of our webinar. So once again, I would like to thank both the speakers, Kevin and Linda, for a fantastic webinar, packed with a lot of information. And I certainly do think that this can be taken back and to some extent implemented in the units. So thank you also to all our attendees today for taking your time out on a Saturday to attend this webinar. We really do appreciate it. So the recording will be sent out at soonest availability. And with that, I will now close the webinar. Thank you for attending and have a pleasant day or evening further. Thank you and goodbye.